Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
The work was long. The pay was good. It was the smell that they couldn't stand. Who would have thought that an advanced compound like this would have them babysitting coffins of all things? The official explanation that it was classified, but there were all kinds of rumors. Some said that they were dead from the war that the company was trying to ID. There were some who said that they had donated their bodies to science and that the company was trying to find a cure for a plague. And then there were other theories, the darker ones. Molly ate her sandwich and looked at the coffins. They sure look creepy. Mr. Missile sat at full attention and looked back. Every 10 seconds he adjusted his position 20 degrees to the right, swiveled his head back and forth to give him total situational awareness. Want a sandwich? Mr. Missile said nothing. Hey, you, pay attention. Molly threw her hands up in exasperation. He blinked and looked at her a moment. What is the matter? She laughed and brushed his cheek with her fingers. You're cute. Small talk during work is important. Why? Because regular people need it. It distracts from keeping watch, which is the main thing we are here to do. He cocked his head to the right in a very defined manner, which Molly knew was the body language, trademark, portion of his programming. Life isn't about just being paid. No, it isn't, but my honor is. I committed to doing a job, so I will do it right. Hey, sometimes communication is part of being on watch. She sighed and rolled her eyes. Do you have specific things related to our job to communicate to me? He looked at her only briefly before resuming watch. No, look. Social bonding helps a team work better. It helps them get to know each other. I am familiar with witty banter. We engaged in it in the field all the time, but we already know each other and go to taverns after work. Your point is not as noteworthy. I'm bored. Bring a book. I can help keep watch for both of us. Molly relaxed and sighed. She waved her ring and began to read holographic projection of a book on a wall. She brushed her hair with her hand and changed it to a romantic novel. Why had she fallen for this guy again? Time passed, and the two of them got into a regular routine. He was a boring jerk during the day, and an increasingly sweet gentleman during the night. She read about every book she could think of, and was in severe danger of becoming enlightened and educated. That would never do. The coffins changed a few times, but mainly just lay there. A few times she even opened them, though Mr. Missile was scandalized. They were definitely not donated bodies or decomposing corpses, but they weren't some race of hyper-intelligent mutants that the corporation was rumored to be creating either. Geez, that was a terrible idea. The Pentarians had gone to war over regular AI enslavement for making artificial beings that'd salt the earth. Then one of the arms twitched. Molly had been bored looking at the corpse, wondering if she could get it to pose in various funny positions. She hadn't figured out a way to distract Missile when she shrieked in surprise. Mr. Missile was there in a heartbeat, pulse pistol drawn, and pointed away but near her. What is it? He leapt over 3 coffins and crouched. It moved. Molly's voice cracked as she felt herself shaking. This was just some 3D nonsense. They were probably on a reality show. Joke or not, Mr. Missile took it very seriously. He lifted the lid of the coffin all the way and looked right in the face of the corpse. He took out a small mirror and held it under the corpse's nose, checking for breath. Nothing there. They sat there and watched the corpse for the better part of an hour. Nothing happened. After a while, Molly sighed. You don't think I'm crazy, do you? Mr. Missile looked at the ceiling, which she knew by now meant that he was checking his pre-installed skillsofts. Then he looked at her and shook his head. I am not a licensed practitioner of mental health, much less a psychologist or internal memeticist, but I do not believe you are displaying any common or recognizable signs of mental disconnection with reality. She sighed and rolled her shoulders. Let's just conduct another vigil again tonight. I want to prepare a few basic medical experiments. I find it highly unlikely our employer would violate HERCRA protocols. Molly shrugged again and grunted noncommittally. Molly, I do not believe that you are insane. Then what happened? I don't know. I do not know. Let's discover it together. She sighed, and deep this time, and finally gave a tiny nod. Excellent, Mr. Missile said. I shall make preparations immediately. The shards of Doma were technically not moons, but shards of bright rock that lit up the night. fingers grasping over the delicate, desperate dregs of the colony that had not found a way to migrate somewhat better, somewhere closer to the core, where ideas and trade took full advantage of the closer stars. And this far from Earth, it wasn't like they could take advantage of the opposite direction. But they were here, and at the low-level lights slowly turned on, their stored charged release over the course of the evening, here was interesting enough. The silver light spilled over the endless rows of coffins, and nothing happened at first. Molly breathed a sigh of relief, but relief turned to horror as she saw a faint clawing sound in the first one, then another, and then dozens of coffins. Then the lids began to move. The hand was the first sign that something was wrong. It wasn't rotten flesh. It just looked like a bad Halloween makeup job. It wasn't the unnatural strength at which it pounded the stone lid off. It was like it was a paperweight. No, it was the motion. In the back of her mind, she knew it was just wrong. What she didn't know was it was the way they moved without the use of muscles. It was more like there were invisible strings pulling them about. No, that wasn't right either. They moved like a horde of invisible people were moving dead bodies, one stop-motion frame at a time. That might be endearing in children's programming. Seeing up close made her breath stop. The horrific march of cadavers put them into two neat little rows, one behind the other as they moved in perfect sync one with the other. From a distance, they would have looked alike, but she could see that they had all once been people. And they began to advance. Molly screamed. She had very healthy lungs and caused Mr. Missile to jump. He looked like he was about to attack, bringing up a stun stick that the corporation had provided both of them as his jaw firmed up. Molly shook her head. "There are too many. We need to run." Mr. Missile scowled, but ultimately shrugged and began to run with her. They were fast, much faster at first than the vampires. Mr. Missile's artificially generated flesh had a lot more endurance, and he quickly outpaced her. As her lungs began to burn, he picked her up like she weighed nothing, and they started dashing downstairs. Given that they were already below ground, this vaguely worried her, but she was too busy trying to catch her breath before she focused on it. He growled, "Why were we not given sufficient weaponry for this assignment?" Molly couldn't help but laugh as he kicked open a wooden door before them. "I think that we weren't meant to fight these guys, just keep other people out." "The corporation had to know what these mutants can do. How could they not?" "I don't think they're mutants." "What are they, then?" Missile was indignant. "They are not artificial beings or robots. They move in an entirely unnatural manner." "I think they're vampires." "Vampires?" He mouthed it out loud. As they leapt into the cave, darkness swallowed them up. While they wandered down the stairs, he kept muttering it under his breath. "Yes, vampires. The fairy tale creatures, drinkers of blood?" "Yes." She stopped, put her down, and looked around. Both their eyes adjusted to the darkness. What appeared to be a large chamber was actually a cave, and it was filled with bats. "You really believe that they are vampires?" Mr. Missile asked incredulously. His voice echoed from the chamber. The bats began to stir. "Yes." "Do you think they believe they are vampires?" Molly blinked as the bats began to stir and swarm. Her heart pounded in her chest. "I don't know." Mr. Missile thought a moment and then reached under his shirt, taking out a small cross. Then he said to Molly, "Keep going deeper into the cave. I will not risk you in this." "What are you going to do?" "You may not realize this, but I am an ordained minister of the Church of Theatrical Explosions. It is an ancient Earth religion brought about when they banned all interesting film on Earth and established the international—" "What are you talking about?" Molly had a hint of desperation in her face. "I am an ordained minister. Holy symbols and faith are a typical potent weapon against vampires. It was a joke, ordnance instead of ordnance, which was the proper spelling. But we all became ministers. Unlike my human companions, I analyzed the possibility of a greater truth and decided that while I might not know what it was, I would embrace my faith fully. I am quite confident that I should be a match for the vampires." "What? You can't bait your life on something like this." I can, and I will. Go, hide." "Not without you." "Will you make my sacrifice in vain?" Mr. Missile's voice was quite calm, but slightly sad. Molly rolled her eyes at the blatantly emotional manipulation, but decided ultimately that there was simply no way this was going to work out in her favor, so she sighed and ran deeper into the cave, trying to ignore something that dropped on her head and shoulders and try not to think about the logical source of what that might be. And then the vampires came. There were a flash flood of bodies slamming into him with supernatural force, but just as the wave of death was going to drown him, Mr. Missile extended his hand and grabbed the cross around his neck. The vampires stopped and shrieked. They were moving at such strength that you could actually hear the crunch of their skeletons crushing as the rear of them pushed the ones in the front. They hissed and shrieked with claws, but not one of them could get any closer than 5 feet. Mr. Missile stood calmly and safely. "By the power of Our Lady of Perpetual Explosions, I forsake thee. I abjure thee back to the depth of bad movies and horror. You shall not pass. By the power of popcorn, I compel thee. By the power of popcorn, I compel thee." The vampires were not crushed by the rush of bodies, began to quiver and shake with pain. A few turned to run, but they clutched at their faces and began to claw. Molly could not believe it. It was like he was using a real religion, but they were sure responding to it. It wasn't like he was even using a real religion, but they were sure responding to it like it was. And then she realized that while the religion might not be real, was there any of them? The faith he exhibited sure was. Of course it was real. Mr. Missile either believed in something all the way or not at all. As they trembled and shook, there was a thick humming in the air, where everything felt furry and thick, like static, only wrapped around her skin like a wool blanket. Then an impossibly high-pitched shriek came from somewhere, maybe the vampires. Molly was never sure, because they burst apart like so much glass, and then there was nothing but dust. It was a long, slow slog back up to the office, but they were able to shower and clean all the crap off themselves and get a clean pair of regular clothing. They had just finished when they heard a great deal of yelling outside. They were about to knock on Mrs. Wilson's door when Mr. Missile picked Molly up in his arms and began to run, again, as fast as he could, out one of the side doors. She noticed how effortlessly it was, and he moved with her, or at least seemed to. At first she swooned a bit, smiling. She had known he was strong, but never that strong. "What's the matter?" she asked, suddenly remembering the horror that they had endured earlier in the day. Talking steadily, but obviously not wanting to waste words, he said, "Drones. I heard combat drones." He kept running, a lot faster than Molly would have ever thought he would be able to run on his own, which is why she let him, despite wanting to run on her own. As she thought about it, she realized that there was no logical reason for them to get closer unless, oh no, humans couldn't hope to outrun drones unless they were armed or in a vehicle. She tried to guess where they were going. She didn't recognize this area. Molly wanted to ask but didn't dare. She knew he was strong and that his body was manufactured in handsome enhancements, but it would tire sooner or later, and she didn't want to slow him down. She was rewarded as they moved through the complex. 4 sets of stairs later, he ran into a vast and empty garage, but there were a few service vehicles, of course. There was a single car and a few delivery trucks, nothing that could fly. The buzzing grew louder and louder until finally she saw them. Federation military drones were deliberately designed to work like the worst kind of giant insects, in ways that fed off the fears of human beings, especially natural ones. They clawed along the walls, their wings humming threateningly. Their compound bioplastic eyes sent shivers down her spine. They were worse than vampires, since those had merely been supernatural. These things were designed to terrify. She didn't scream. She managed not to, just barely, but it took work. He tried to open the doors in the 2 of the vehicles, but they were thoroughly locked. The drones came closer, emitting a kind of mist. Molly had seen that mist leave harsh red marks on the skins of those it touched, and she did not want it touching her. Mr. Missile grunted in frustration and finally bellowed at the last vehicle, pounding his fist against the windshield. But they had long since stopped using glass, and despite his considerable strength, these vehicles were designed for heavy industry, and his fist bounced harmlessly off. Grunting, he made a few pensive motions, took a deep breath, and then picked Molly up again. He ran out the door, just barely faster than the drones or the cloud they emitted. As they turned a corner, he whispered between breaths, "I need you to type a message asking for help. You won't be able to send it down here. It's a secure building, but it needs to get out before they jam it. Can you do that?" Molly nodded. Like most people in the former Federation, she had a mind-machine interface, but it was only allowed for personal use or emergencies. This clearly counted as an emergency, and she closed her eyes, slowly picturing the numbers she needed to unlock it. She would have forgotten, but it wasn't possible with this standard Federation model. It wasn't impossible with this standard Federation model. It was just very discouraged. On and on he ran. The beads of sweat finally began to pour down his back, and she could see the augmented reality swim up around her. She would have been criminally prosecuted in the old days. Now she could legally do it, but everyone would hate her for it if it wasn't life or death. Right now, she didn't care about their judgment. Nothing mattered but trying to save her beloved Mr. Missile. She knew that his perfect forged mind placed in sculpted flesh, that he would die for her. And she knew that she loved him because he was perfect in everything he did. And that was why she knew he was going to die. She hated it, hated the bright yellow line that showed the distance that they had to run in front of the drone to get out of their jamming field. Hated the velocity her system tracked, showing that they would reach it in 10 minutes. 10 minutes of Mr. Missile running at speeds no natural human could reach, carrying her, saving her. He grunted, a bit of blood coming out of his mouth. He loved her. He loved her with the entirety of his being, and right now he was giving her his very life. There was nothing artificial about it. Frothing, the distance grew and grew. She knew he was not a lie, not a slave, just perfect. And she loved him back. Not even the kind of love you might have in a crush or for a soulmate, but for a passionate, perfect sinking. Something pure she could not speak of, just be. And the message was sent. It instantly got through to the authorities. Normally that might be an indifferent police officer, but a Pentarian cruiser in orbit was still part of the occupation until all agreed reforms were complete. Using a microburst of FTL drive, it occupied the sky in seconds, but it was still too late. The drones fled and were atomized by the cruiser's lightning guns, but it was still too late. She knelt down beside the fallen form of Mr. Missile and cried, and it was still too late. The crimson lightning cannons howled around her, sending shards of dust from desiccated and atomized drones to the four winds, and she did not care. The mighty lumbering giant she loved, the awkward, too honest lummox, breathed and bled and died. The sun rose up, as it always did. It had a way of doing that in situations like this. She cried for 7 days. It had felt like she had died, and the love she felt did not become any less. If anything, she needed it now with distance and time. Molly briefly wondered if she could cheat, if there was some backup of his AI somewhere, but she knew it didn't work like that. True AI, the kind the Nest made and that the Federation used, could only have one instance of a mind at a time, no matter how fast it could make them or use ghost copies. He was dead, and he wasn't coming back. She knew that she needed to move on, and she would. She had a ticket for tomorrow to see the stars, to see where he had been born in blood and fire and war, and she would. But she smiled at something else, too. It was cliché, but it was true enough. She had had them take a sample of DNA from Mr. Missile's body. She had wanted it to be the physical act of love, but science could do what lovemaking could not. A piece of her friend would live on with her forever as her son. She felt her belly and felt right. No matter what anyone else said, she would have his soul with her forever through him. Names floated around in her mind until she felt one that felt perfect. Smiling, she wiped away bitter tears and looked out the window, over the horizon of the city, and out into the stars beyond.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, available in many markets, including at Amazon.com. Copyright 2018, Red Anvil Amalgamated, LLC.
To fight the forces of evil!